Phillipe Reines, welcome to the Dispatch Podcast.
Thank you for having me back.
We speak today, which is Friday, the night after the debate between President Biden and former President Donald Trump. It is Friday afternoon. As someone who has seen many of these debates, has participated as a debating stand-in during preparations, what did you make of last night's debate? Specifically, what did you make of Joe Biden's performance?
It wasn't good. I think it's as simple as that. It's not, though, an ELE, an extinction level event, as I think geologists and such call it. He is a good president who had a bad night. Donald Trump is a bad ex-president who had a good night. And it was the first time in 6 one-on-one general election debates that he finally did well. But I think defining well is important in that Joe Biden's performance, whether you want to call it halting or however you describe it, took away from the fact that Donald Trump's performance was more of the same, was identical to Donald Trump of a year ago, 2 years ago, January 6, 2021. And that's unfortunate because it's the president's responsibility to make sure that people understand what it's like to have Donald Trump back as president. And last night, more than anything to me, was a big missed opportunity.
Were you surprised? I mean, before this debate, there's obviously been clips of President Biden looking like he might not, be the top of his game, to say the least. Obviously, some, the accusation was those clips were cut in such a way, and maybe sometimes they were, to make him look worse than he was. The fear is last night that this was supposed to show that was not true, and in fact, instead, it reinforced those. Were you surprised about his abilities to speak and his energy? Did anything about last night surprise you? I mean, in the context of you are an insider, you probably hear stories of people that meet with President Biden. You know probably more than most the truth of whether he is, as someone said, doing cartwheels in the Oval Office or not on top of events day to day. So what was there anything surprising from last night?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a friend of mine asked me earlier today how my predictions panned out over the last few days or the last weeks. And I went through them and I got a fair amount of them right. I got some wrong. They pertain to both the president individually and Donald Trump individually and just the dynamic on the whole. I start from a place where Joe Biden is 80 years old. He's no spring chicken. Donald Trump is about 80 years old. He is no spring chicken. So let's take this one piece at a time. They're the same age. If your father is 81 and your mother is 78, you don't say dad married a younger woman. Neither of them should be driving. Thankfully, they're not. That's not the job that one of them held and one of them holds now. In terms of cognitive ability, as defined by speech, I find whatever you want to say or glean about Joe Biden from appearance, I find it both frustrating and hysterical that when Donald Trump is the opponent, that this is somehow an uneven playing field. Donald Trump he basically wages war on the English language on a daily basis. He has just in the last few months, he thinks that we're up to World War II. He forgets that there was a Second World War. He thinks he's running against Barack Obama. I mean, anyone who's watched Donald Trump over the last 6-7 years cannot possibly think that his behavior and his speech is indicative of someone who's all there. Third, is physical health. There's no doubt in my mind that when I'm 81, I'd rather be in Joe Biden's body. Donald Trump literally forged his doctor's note in 2015, like he was a fifth grader. It said all of his vitals and tests were positive. And I remember a doctor saying, they're not all supposed to be positive. You don't want your HIV test to be positive. I mean, actually forged it. He then disappears to the hospital one day in 2019, doesn't tell anyone why for a year. Then he says he went in, he had some extra time for a colonoscopy. Jamie, I don't know how old you are. I don't know if you had a colonoscopy. I have. You don't just show up to the colonoscopy shop and take one. It's a multi-day fast. It requires a fair number of things, including anesthesia, which when he was asked, he said he did not take. Then lastly, he came about as close to death as one can come having COVID. Whether it was his oxygen levels, whether any indicia about it. His own doctor had to come back out. Sean Conley, I think his name is, had to come back out a day after his initial briefing and said that he was too positive about what he'd said the day before. And the reason I bring that up is if Joe Biden had been in that position, essentially rushed to Walter Reed Medical Hospital and had COVID that bad for that many days, everything he would be doing now, the speech, the walking, you'd have panel after panel on cable news about, is long COVID affecting his speech? Is long COVID affecting his walk? So if this is the basis that we're going to have on the assessing the two, then let's have it evenly. Now, I think it sucks that this is the comparison. And by the way, my frustration is mostly with my party. You know, it's this. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, there's no question that some of what you say is, or maybe all of what you say is true. I mean, Donald Trump is probably the heaviest president since Taft in the White House. And maybe he lost some weight, they say, after during his wilderness years here. I don't know. I haven't seen him in person. And obviously his diet is famously not great, the cheeseburgers from McDonald's. But there is no question that just performatively looking at them, looking at the energy levels, just as appearances, which debates matter, appearances, one does look much more vigorous than the other and does at this age. But I guess my question to you is, have you heard at all through the grapevine? I mean, there was a lot.
No, I mean, I didn't answer your question the first time. I mean, there are people I've worked with over the years and who I count as some of my closest friends who work for him now, who I don't mean work in some office in OEOB that see him once a month. People who see him regularly. They say he speaks softly. He walks slowly. It's exactly what we see, but he's with it and sharp. And he's a cantankerous old man. I wish there was a camera on him all the time, because from what I hear, he's more than capable of snapping at staff for something stupid in a speech. He's more than capable of taking someone's laptop and editing it with track changes to make it easier than dictating. We don't see that. And that's not a criticism, but unfortunately it's been reduced. Our vision of him has been reduced to at podiums, staring into cameras, squinting for, he looks what he looks like. He's 81. And I get it. I get the optics of life. I get all of that. It's, to me, and I hadn't thought about this until you just asked, if he had come out last night obviously looking identically, but gave great answers, I'm not exactly sure how the debate would be discussed today. Probably too much about his appearance.
Yeah. Here's the issue, I think. You have a lot of pro-Biden. We've seen some bad debate performances in the past. I mean, famously, Barack Obama's first debate performance, he made him better against Mitt Romney. I have never seen pro someone commentators, Biden commentators in this case, people that are
Yep.
for him all the way, from Tim Miller, who's a center, I guess center right Biden supporter these days,
Yep.
at the Bulwark, who I think thinks Biden's the best president of the 21st century, to Joe Scarborough, to
Yep.
the entire cast of MSNBC, to CNN, say that what they saw last night is not a man who can run for president, that he needs to bow out and then have something that I don't know how long we have seen something even similar, a convention decide the nominee. Do you think that Joe Biden should bow out? And what would the mechanisms look like in order to choose a new nominee?
I don't think he should bow out, not because I'm some kind of medical or otherwise expert who can observe him and come to my own opinion. I implicitly trust the people around him and work for him and him, frankly, to make that decision. So that's the first part. The second part is maddening to me. And to put it in a little bit of context, it's a terrible analogy because it's not analogous, but it's reminding me of the Access Hollywood weekend where the Republican Party panicked. And infamously, Reince Priebus, the GOP chairman, went up to Trump Tower to plead with him to bow out. And they had done that to some extent earlier in the season where everyone was panicking to get him to not be the nominee. So I think there is a notion, freneticism is unfortunately contagious in these orbits. You see that as much as I do. But let's just say, for sake of argument, that someone was going to pursue this. Forget about the front end of this, which is Joe Biden deciding not to run. Exactly, working backwards, who is it that anyone thinks should be the nominee? Because whenever I have this conversation with someone, by the way, this has been going on since the primaries. I mean, you had people in the primaries who were saying, Biden should be running for re-election. He should get out of the way. And it should be X. And you never hear the same name twice. Someone I bumped into months ago said Cory Booker. They really like Cory Booker. You get a lot of people who say Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom. Now, on the one hand, I don't know if any of them could beat Donald Trump. On the other hand, it really doesn't matter, because is someone suggesting the Democratic Party and its 4,500 delegates could come to some kind of consensus on who the best person is, and that person not be the sitting vice president of the United States? You've got a three-part problem here. One, Joe Biden is president. He's running for re-election. So it's a moot point until he says otherwise. If he were to say otherwise, why wouldn't it be Kamala? And if for some reason people went around Kamala because they don't think she's up for it, that would have a tremendous negative impact on the process. That someone would say, oh, the first Black woman to hold the job isn't up for running for president. We should bypass her in favor of a white male. I mean, does anyone think that that's actually would happen? So let's just take another extreme. Barack Obama. Forget about the Constitution. Let's just stick Barack Obama's name in there. Barack Obama, I think, would beat Donald Trump. He could certainly raise $1 billion pretty quick. He's vetted. I'm not suggesting this. I'm just giving it as an example. And he would smooth over any ruffled feathers, or he would render them moot. I can't think of another person that fits that bill. And if you can't figure out who that person is, then the process is moot, and the process does not exist. The process, I mean, technically, Joe Biden is not the nominee. Technically, we do not have a nominee, but that's not the point. Well, let's just say the process could be, redone. Obviously, any process can be redone. You're talking about, at the end of the day, who is it you think? I mean, is there anyone polling better head to head? I haven't seen that.
Well, can I throw this out? I tweeted last night the same thing. The problem is, for it to matter, you have to figure out, because there seems to be a consensus that Kamala Harris would be worse against Donald Trump than even Joe Biden, whether that's true or not. But assuming
you think all 4,500 delegates agree with that?
I
mean, all you need.
But to play your
name,
not that
game, I agree or disagree.
To play your name game, assuming you got past that, I did it a little bit in my mind. It's one of the reasons you're on here. I said, well, Gavin Newsom obviously is good in front of a camera, but I don't know if his record is that great in California, and the skeletons in the vetting process are probably somewhat significant or potentially significant. Josh Shapiro might be the best qualified governor right now to do it. He would be an interesting candidate, but I don't know if he has the juice. But there is someone who's vetted and who's run for president before.
Oh God, don't do it. Don't do it.
Have you had has there been any conversations with Hillary Clinton?
I've exchanged notes with her since last night, and she basically feels very strongly that Democrats, she has felt the same way for a year now when it comes to this notion of President Biden stepping out of the way or bypassing Kamala, or how President Biden's health is treated by Democrats. She believes that people need to gut up, that there is a huge opportunity cost when Democrats sit around and talk about these fantastical scenarios, but then don't do anything past that. If you want to sit around and talk about, oh, I can see how we'd end up with Gina Raimondo. I mean, it's hysterical how everyone ends up with the name that they thought a year ago would be the best president. They coincidentally just happen to be the best person now. So Pete Buttigieg, who I like, you're going to skip over Kamala Harris and put Pete Buttigieg in, who got basically 0% of the black vote in 2020. Like, that's not going to work out. But there's an opportunity cost when people when there's paralysis. I just literally came from the studio van, they bring the van in, they have the dish. Yeah. And I did a Fox hit against Clay Travis, who I think is Rush Limbaugh's, he was his successor on the Martha McCallum show.
Sexton. Yeah, it's a two-person successor.
Yeah. And that's not an easy conversation in general, let alone the day after a debate like that. And I basically tried to make the argument that I just made to you. I tried to do it in 60 seconds, but if you want to have a conversation about age, fine. They're the same age. You want to have a conversation about cognition? Trump is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. If you want to have a conversation about health, Donald Trump lies about his. He conceals his, and he is a walking, not healthy person. Dems don't do that. And it reminds me a lot of us in email in 2016. So email, without relitigating it, obviously became a problem. And Dems would whisper, what was she thinking? Bad judgment. And that's fine. Whisper away. But they stopped there. They didn't go the next step and say, okay, fine, it was a mistake, but boy, is it stupid. And let's not forget, Donald Trump has gone bankrupt 6 times. He has never held office. He is incompetent. You can go on and on and on. It's that opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of paralysis, in my mind, is very high. And that's what I think is happening now. And I believe Hillary has been in the same place when I've spoken to her about it prior to today. I know that that's where her head is. And I know that she thinks that people need to defend the president.
Let me just put this aside for a second. Is there a scenario where Joe Biden made the decision, let's say the poll numbers collapse after this, we don't know where they're going to go, and Kamala Harris also decided to step aside, where she would would, if
Why?
asked.
Why? But why is that? I mean, that is
It's a big. I
crazy.
agree. I agree. I agree. But maybe if certain party heavyweights, uh, you know, James Clyburn and Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama came to both Biden and Harris and said, "This is such an important moment."
This isn't a movie. I mean, I don't think it works that way. I
So,
mean, Joe
but
Biden.
let me play this hypothetical.
Okay,
Do you
you
think?
played mine. I'll play yours.
Do you think there's any circumstances, assuming those two stepped aside, that if asked and this went to a brokered convention, Hillary Clinton would consider the nomination?
No, I also think it's doesn't matter. I mean, first of all, brokered convention. If any of this were to happen, I'm just playing along, not just with Hillary. You would need to go into the convention with being wired somewhat.
Yeah.
This can't be 80 names put into nomination and then 700 ballots until we end up with someone who.
No,
But
but wouldn't it need to be? I mean, you would have to go in with Joe Biden and Barack Obama, and well, obviously Bill Clinton's going to support his wife, but and Nancy Pelosi and all the party heavyweights, and Kamala Harris around one person, right? You'd have to have it would have to be the most famous names in the Democratic
okay,
Party.
I'm stipulating. Right. I disagree with those steps, but since you played along with mine, I will stipulate that if all that happened and President Biden were swayed, and for some reason Vice President Harris were to say, "Don't mind me," I'll just stay as the vice presidential nominee, and you can pick someone and layer me. Let's just say that. I have to say this every 10 seconds, just in case someone is dialing in and hearing me having this hypothetical. If the solution, if the concern with Joe Biden is, or forget about last night for a moment, if the general concern of people has been in this race that they don't like the choice between two 80-year-olds, why wouldn't you pick someone in their 40s? Now, I don't think a Josh Shapiro would win right now. He'd be tar and feathered by the RNC before he even got out of the gate. But why wouldn't that be the approach? Why wouldn't it be something to excite younger people? I mean, obviously, I'm biased. I think Hillary Clinton should have been president. I think she should be president. If Joe Biden doesn't want it, I'd be happy if she ran for it, when she's 100. But
I think
that's not
the issue in this hypothetical would be you would need
who
someone
is most efficient to
who's vetted as
rally
well
around.
and vetted. That we know whether you think there's
Yeah.
scandals or not. The scandals that are going to come out or that have been litigated. All these other candidates have never been, or almost all of them, in the presidential stage.
Well, I'm no longer her spokesman, but I think if she were on with us right now, she would scoff.
Does she want to join?
And she would hit the leave button, because that's just not something she would do. Not only because she believes Joe Biden is a good president, and I'm not just saying that, I know she does, but because that's just not the solution she would think. Also, I think just because she's a known entity doesn't mean the right wing wouldn't just have a field day with it. I mean, I would argue.
Sure they would.
Well, but I would argue that someone needs to happen. Like if you put vetting aside, if someone were fully vetted, the benefit would be that the focus would be on Trump. I mean, that's to go back where I started, the most disappointing to me last night was if you were to just watch the half of the screen of Trump, he's still lying through his teeth. He's still just saying things that aren't true. And here's an example. So I was on Fox and I was watching the previous interview. It was Chris Coons, and he was one-on-one with Martha McCallum. And then Martha asked him, how did Joe Biden forget that 13 soldiers died in the withdrawal of Afghanistan? Now, first of all, I don't remember that being what happened last night. But I do remember Donald Trump saying, "No one died on my watch." Now, I thought that was interesting because it's always stuck with me that 4 special forces died in Niger or Niger, I don't know how to pronounce it, in 2018. So why is he allowed to forget what happened on his watch without anyone talking about cognition problems, about who dies and when, but not?
Well, I think it's obviously performance based here. I mean, and also
Yeah,
Trump.
but I think it's the responsibility. I don't I don't think it's my responsibility or my role to just throw my hands up in the air and say,
Yeah,
yeah, it's performative and we're stuck with that. I don't want to look at my Twitter feed for days because I don't want to see what response was I get when I go on Fox.
yeah.
But I do hope there were 10 people out of the 2 million who said, oh, yeah, that's a fair point. He is, you know, he does a lot of the same things because he's orange. He looks like he's tanned and healthy. I mean, I don't know what to, I can't, if we cede the point of optics, then it's over. Could have told you that a year ago. And by the way, then, there are a lot of people who should have beaten Donald Trump. I still believe with all my being that Donald Trump was a terrible president. And that somehow people need to remember that it wasn't just because he looked up at the sky when there was an eclipse without glasses, that he did some horrible things and they got worse every year. And this isn't, people shouldn't think that they saw this scary movie and the second time around they know when to shut their eyes because they're not going to fall for it twice. This is a sequel. This is like Scream, where each movie gets worse. He's going to pick up where he left off. The last 2 things he did leaving off was, 1, was trying to overturn the election, and 2, thinking it was funny to whip up whatever verb you want to use, the January 6th attack. You think he's just going to come back in and go back to using a magic marker on weather maps and that's going to be the extent of it? And people need to think that through. And people, Joe Biden and his campaign and surrogates and party faithful and activists need to remind people. And there's nothing about what Donald Trump last night, nothing about what he said that should give anyone pause or any kind of reason to think that what I'm saying is lighting my hair on fire.
And look, I think about January 6th every time when I think about this election. I don't think all of America does, though, because it's not a day-to-day thing.
I don't know. I mean, we make a big deal out of this when we say people say this, people say that. I have a friend who yells at me every time I do that because I don't know what 300 million people think. There are these subsets of people. I don't know who they are, or why they are, or how they can't make a decision. But the reason I'm bringing this up is the January 6th stuff is there was polling prior through the primaries that people were, if he were to be found guilty of any of these crimes, no matter which trial, even though the intelligentsia said, oh, the Stormy trial is stupid, it's baked into the cake, that they would not necessarily abandon Donald Trump, but they would be unhappy and they wouldn't necessarily flock to Joe Biden. But I would say basically that they'd be a jump ball or they'd be gettable, whatever you want to call them. And that has borne out since the trial. You have these subsets, particularly independents. And I do think that those people are, in particular, don't like his January 6th stuff. And he, Donald Trump, and you can, tell me if you don't see it this way, but Donald Trump, he didn't have to move to the center in 2016. 2020, it wasn't about policy. It was about just his being angry. A lot of his routine now when he talks to his people is the January 6th, whatever you want to call them, people who were put away, that they are patriots and should be pardoned. Whenever Donald Trump is faced with a moment where he has to decide between saying what his base wants to hear and saying what a little change or softer that might appeal, he never veers from what the base wants to hear. I take your point about January 6th, but I do think that one of the elements of the people who are up for grabs is they are uncomfortable that he thinks it was no big deal. And he is, he didn't answer it last night. He still believes they should all be pardoned. And I think if that's something that is continued to beat home, then that might make a little difference. We're talking about 40,000 people have elected, fewer people than fit into FedEx Field.
Yeah, I do want to address the hypothetical that I'm coming up with, because I understand that every election season, will they drop the vice president and replace him? They did that with Bush and Cheney in the second one, and they do it over and over again. And
it's the quadrennial stuff of brokered convention, electoral college tie is the next one.
I understand, and in fact, when I suggested this concept for a thematic episode for the podcast 2 weeks ago, I said we should bring one on just hypothetically to see how this would happen.
It's fun.
It's implausible. And I'll say before I go on what I'm going to say, but President Obama tweeted out earlier this afternoon, we're speaking Friday, bad debates happen. Trust me, I know, blah, blah, blah. I stand with Joe Biden. Biden looked better in a speech today in North Carolina, tried to address it. I mean, I don't know where his cold went. He seemed tanned and a little different. But I think what makes this different is you have all these media figures that are generally favorable to Joe Biden, whether it's the New York Times op-ed section, specific columnists especially that talk to him, Tom Friedman, Nicholas Kristof, the MSNBC hosts, almost all of them, CNN, saying, wow, this does show that this is a man maybe not fit and it's time for him to step aside. And therefore, the ads are just going to write themselves. Trump's going to say, even his friends say he's not capable. And
well, you can say even
capable.
Well, hold on. Even your vice president, Mike Pence,
it's a good point,
says you shouldn't be. I mean, you fight fire with fire. I take President Obama's point. I will concede. I think this is a notch different than a bad night because people just look at Joe Biden and have a view. So it really doesn't. That's why I had given in our battle of hypotheticals, I had said, let's say he gave great answers last night. You would still have the right saying anytime he got any kind of syllable wrong that he shouldn't be president. They've been saying this beforehand. It's their hobby horse. The right loves going after people's health. They did it with Hillary. They did it with Pelosi. They do it with women in particular. They're doing it with Biden. And God bless them. They do it well. But usually they do it.
To it here, though. I mean, I remember with Clinton, she had that incident where she collapsed. It helped lead into what they were saying before, which was, that she's ill.
I mean, it was she's not ill. I mean, I was with her the day before. She stupidly knew she had, pneumonia, and she didn't take it easy. She shouldn't have prepped.
Is this different? Isn't there potentially?
Well, that's why I'm saying that I think I do think it's different, which is why we all have to figure out how to say, yeah, he's old, but so is the other guy. Yeah, he jumbles some words, but the other guy is nutso. And this is not, I don't want to be the person offering 10 different things, but one of the things that I think President Biden never talks about enough is his stuttering. And my understanding, and again, I read this. This is not anyone whispering in my ears like, can you introduce this as a talking point? My understanding is that it gets harder. The tricks of the trade on controlling stuttering get harder. I know the people who prepped him. I know them pretty well. I worked for them in general. I worked for them in the prep for Hillary. I imagine, and this is another one that sounds like a talking point, is I'm sure they wish they had more time. You can't, 5 days is not enough. And I think they will be scared straight. A big difference this year is because it's not the package of 3 of the Presidential Debate Commission. Yeah, there's this September 10th ABC debate, but wow, that's a long time away. And it also feels, I mean, if you took a poll of insiders in DC, most of them think it won't happen. So when President Obama had a rough first debate, or President Bush had a rough first debate against John Kerry, or Al Gore did in 2000 when he came out looking, his makeup looking orange, you knew you just had to get 10 more days or 2 more weeks. Unfortunately, you got a long road here before. But, the Supreme Court could have let out a decision this morning and you and I wouldn't be talking about this. Now, that doesn't make it, I don't mean that it's not an issue. If someone is basing their vote on who looks tanner, they don't care why, they don't care if it's a tanning bed, then look, you're going to vote for Donald Trump. If someone wants to vote for hair, I mean, I don't know, but you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to vote for height. You're allowed to vote for anything you want, but you should have as much of the information in front of you. The Republicans are doing a great job of making sure that the information in front of the American people about Joe Biden is about as bad as it gets. I don't think we as a party, going back to, honestly, 2015, have done enough on the health front. And anyone in my life, if they were on right now, they would say he has not shut up about this since day one. And I think is it the rooster? The crows are coming home to roost. What is it?
I think that sounds right.
Something's coming back to roost, where we've given this guy a free pass on his health stuff, and it's so crazy to me that of all candidates, he's the one that's benefiting from someone confusing some words every now and then. I mean, I don't, and I'm also, it's not like Joe Biden concealed his age from us when he ran in 2019. And it's not like he won the nomination by a hair. I mean, he walloped the field. Just absolutely walloped. And people are mad at him for running for re-election. Oh my God, how dare he? I mean, I'm sorry. It's just, this is where we are. This is where we're going to be for 130 more days. How it plays out, how people factor it in, I don't know. But for 130 days, we have to call out the bullshit. And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to close on this. There's obviously a non-zero chance, and maybe even a greater than 50% chance that Donald Trump is the next president again.
Mm-hmm.
He's also talked about retribution.
Yep.
Have you talked with your former boss, Hillary Clinton, about whether she worries that in a second Trump administration that she could be targeted for prosecution if Donald Trump
I don't think she personalizes it. I know she's scared to death of him winning again because she knows that the guardrails didn't work the first time around.
Didn't they? Didn't they work? Overall? I mean, it does seem like
I don't think so, because I see what you're saying, except the guardrails that actually, the reason he left office was because his Republican vice president didn't go along with the joke. The Georgia Republican governor didn't come up with the 11,000 votes he wanted. His Republican Secretary of Defense didn't, seize the ballot boxes. His Republican Attorney General refused to say publicly that there was any fraud. In fact, he made a point of saying the opposite. So the fact that he left office, I don't think that's a function of guardrails. I think that's a function of, in his mind, that he picked the wrong people. He was enamored by the Bill Barrs of the world and the Jim Mattises. And I don't think he particularly learns from mistakes, but I do think this one's pretty obvious that, but for Mike Pence, God knows what would have happened. And thankfully, we passed, I'm blanking on the name of the legislation about making it so much harder. But
don't you think the Supreme Court would have? I mean, I think it was too close.
he would have ignored it. But at the end of the day, if you just say, okay, fine, I'm ignoring you, what does the Supreme Court do? Send it to U.S. Marshals? I mean, it's all predicated. I mean, you know who must be turning their grave is Richard Nixon. Like, he left office because people came to him and said, you got to go. The Supreme Court's going to do X. I mean, Donald Trump must think he's the biggest sucker in the world. If you just ignore it, I don't know.
You think?
I don't know what.
Do you not think that if you passed 12 o'clock,
I don't want
the military would have, not allowed? I mean, they would have, his guard would have stood down at the end of his. I mean, I like to think that
I would like to think, but my God, I mean, we're not sure. And this is what you're calling the guardrails, is whether the military. I mean, it's not supposed to come down to that. And Trump and the Republicans were furious with Mark Milley. Imagine if he picks someone. You're now in a position where he's going to choose his guardrails. It's like self-imposed.
Given what you're saying, your boss has never talked about the threat of prosecution. I mean, she must have thought about it the first time when he said lock her up. I mean,
this is I was about to say this is a bit. Well, hold on a second, Jamie. He says he never said lock her up. I think this has been par for the course with her, and I don't think these folks. I don't know if they don't believe it. I don't know but I honestly think that it scares the bejesus out of them that he might get back in. I mean, the example that's stupid, but I keep thinking of is, he came back from Paris after seeing their military parade, and he wanted one, and they resisted him, and then he kept saying he wanted one. They told him that the tanks would do too much damage to Pennsylvania Avenue, and he kind of, just gave up. Could you imagine a year from now, if Donald Trump is president and someone tries to tell him that the tanks are too heavy for Pennsylvania Avenue? I mean, there will be if you look at why he was stopped, for instance, he blames John McCain with the infamous, voting against repealing Obamacare. I think a smarter president with a smarter congressional outreach staff. I mean, don't forget, the Freedom Caucus in the House voted against repealing Obamacare because they were so pissed at how Steve Bannon handled them. It was one vote. Are you telling me that a Jeb Bush or a Mitt Romney wouldn't have gotten either McCain or Murkowski or Collins? And I guess I'm saying that because all these failures were so close. So that his executive orders in the first week about, the Muslim ban, they just thought, I write it in a piece of paper and I send it and it's done. Or him telling his caddy to order the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, all you need now is someone with a little bit more sense. He doesn't need to learn to be a better president. He doesn't need to act better. He's still going to get phone calls from the craziest people with the craziest clips. But if you've got a Stephen Miller as chief of staff, or Stephen Miller, I mean, the thing that scares me to death is this 2025 project, where unlike 2017, where they came in with no one, and worse for them, they thought the best way to control government was leaving it empty. They realized that's not it. So you've got enough people here. I mean, they're going to put people in cabinet, sub-cabinet, political appointee positions that don't hesitate for a second when he says something. And this is, since I know you want to wrap, this is the craziest thing. Okay, you'll love this. Since we're talking hypotheticals. Given his disregard for the rules, or his innate temptation to bend them, and I now think break them. So my theory relies on the fact on him getting Senate confirmed people, which he wouldn't get right now because it's, Democratic controlled. And even if it flips, he might not get because it could only be a Republican majority by 2 or 3. and you might have 2 or 3 sane people although the sane people are heading for the doors, if I were them, and I don't mind saying it out loud because I know they're crazy enough to have thought about this, I bet they have considered the idea of using the Vacancies Act to stick people in where they want them, because they will take the opinion that X was Senate confirmed in like 1952, and therefore he can go anywhere. Now, that's not what the Vacancy Act was for, but he tested the limits of the Vacancy Act during his term. And yeah, the courts didn't side with him. But again, if you just run roughshod, if you say, I want Sebastian Gorka to be my Deputy Secretary of Defense, you're telling me that the guardrail is the poor military aide who refuses to put the Bible out and swear him in? I mean, I just don't see that. And whereas he was played by the relatively reasonable people in his White House and his administration, there ain't going to be none of them around. None. And then he can do what he wants. He can sit and watch TV all day. He could be the exact same person. But the folks around him, they aren't going to be Reince Priebus and, every other person that worked there that never worked in government, no golf caddies, no, none of that stuff. No personal bodyguards who suddenly become Oval Office operations, or him trying to make his helicopter pilot head of Air Force One. There are going to be a few people, at least in key positions. And again, I think Stephen Miller is probably the number one, who will hear what he says and just leave the room and get it done. And you're telling me Stephen Miller would be concerned about whether the courts turn it over? No. And also, I mean, we're going to find out pretty soon where the courts are in terms of presidential authority and presidential immunity, but I think they probably feel pretty good about the makeup of this court on some of this stuff.
Phillipe Reines, thank you for joining the Dispatch podcast.
Thank you for this hypothetical fest. I love it. I'm going to go now and fret about all the things you brought up that are additional threats to our democracy.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.